Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming to this luncheon. And we are really excited about this panel. I can't begin to tell you how wonderful it is to have these two guests. I think as Mr. Bossert will remember, I started on this project about a year and a half ago. And he's been very gracious. He's wanted to do it, but there's been some challenges of his very busy schedule. And Ms. Bickert has been a true friend of Duke Law School. This is her third time back, and she has been very, very gracious. I met them both, by the way, at the Aspen Security Forum. And the wonderful thing about that forum is you actually get to talk to people. And it's good for me because when you're looking for speakers for a student audience especially, you need to have speakers who are kind of like human beings. And not everybody in this space is necessarily qualifies with that. So, in fact, we are going to talk about artificial intelligence and whether artificial intelligence can help us counter online terrorism. I want to thank my administrative assistant, Courtney Smith, for helping to set this up. And I also want to introduce our first Duke Law School cyber scholar, Sana. She just came on board. And I think you'll, as you probably know, Duke University, but really Duke Law School, we've gone from 0 to about 100 miles an hour in the cyberspace. I think just as recently as 2 years ago, David Hoffman and I and Jeff Ward were the only people who were teaching anything related to cyber, and now we're developing very robust programs. And I think some of you are already in the cyber law and policy course, which is the first one we've had. I'm very, very excited about that. And I also, some of you may not know Professor Stansbury, Shane, who's running that cyber law and policy course. He's new to Duke Law School, and some of you know that he was a former prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. But now let me introduce our speakers. Tom Bossert is the former advisor, White House advisor for Homeland Security, and his career is very interesting because he spent a lot of time in government. And one thing I did not know, Tom, was that you worked for FEMA at part of your career. He went to his undergraduate was at the University of Pittsburgh, and he got his law degree at George Washington University. And one of the things I'm going to ask him after we talk about the digital threats is his career, because it's an illustration of how you can use your law degree in some non-traditional ways. Tom has been an extremely busy person the last couple of years, and we're now having that opportunity to have him here. Monica also has a very interesting career. She is currently Vice President of Facebook for Global Policy Management and Counterterrorism. And she is also a, hate to say this, Harvard Law grad. But she began her career, she was a U.S. attorney for a while, for 11 years, I think. Did gang prosecutions and white-collar crime prosecutions in Washington and also in Chicago. But I think the most interesting part of your career prior to Facebook was when you were seconded to the State Department in Thailand and doing legal work with respect to human trafficking and so forth. Again, we'll have a chance a little bit later on, because I really do want to leave time for you all to ask questions where we can explore this different career path that you may want to consider for yourselves, or at least know a little bit more about. I'd like to start our dialogue, and I really do want this to be a dialogue, with kind of a question that is sort of debated, believe it or not. How serious is the threat? And is it really as grievous as some people would have you believe? Are we on the verge of losing our democracy, or digital Pearl Harbor, or so forth? Because one of the counters to that, Thomas Ridd and so forth has written about this, is that if it was really such a terrible thing, you know, the lights would be out now or something like that. So either one of you want to take a stab at that?
Tom does.
I'll do it. Can you hear me first? I guess that's the
Big question. Thank you for being here. It's a beautiful day, and it must not have been difficult, I'm sure, to come here to eat the pizza, but it's probably a little difficult to motivate to come listen to us. Thank you, Charlie, for this invitation. So the threat, I want to talk about it in a couple of different ways. People that talk about threat then tend to get into consequences, and they tend to get into vulnerabilities, and that means risk and not the threat. So just the threat are there people out there that mean us, harm, or is there ill will? Yeah, of course. So in terms of terrorists that want to actually cause physical harm, I think the FBI director reported recently that we've got 5,000 ongoing FBI investigations, terrorism investigations worldwide. 1,000 of them are in the United States. In other words, potential homegrown terrorist threats. Some of them are not going to pan out. Some of them are, somebody that got a phone call from a neighbor that was aggrieved for some really specious reason. Others are going to pan out, and they're going to turn out to be people that if we didn't interdict them or intercede in some way in their path, would try to kill people. But what we've seen is that has changed in a way. We don't think it's as easy nowadays, given a lot of effort and investment, to pull off the massive, cataclysmic 9/11 style attack. And so what we're seeing is a trend towards smaller. You've seen this in the last 2 years. Smaller attacks where they'll drive a van into 8 people, stab 10 people, a small explosive to kill people outside of a concert. It's gruesome and it's terrible, but it's smaller scale. And so people that get into the size of the consequence would say to you that statistically that's not a big deal. But it's an awful big deal if you're the person blown up in front of a concert or their parent.
Well, let me press you a little.
But if I can, just a real quick shift there, then there's the separate cyber question, and we're going to talk about that all day. But the digital threat of causing a physical effect in real space, is a little bit harder to answer. So the vulnerability is there. It's constant. It's evolving. But they're all very fragile, and they're very short-term in their vulnerability, right? So it might take 6 months to a year for a very, very sophisticated cyber hacker to find a vulnerability, develop an exploit, and work their way into your network. And they can only stay there for a certain period of time before they're either inevitably caught or in some cases just wrung out of the system through a regular maintenance cycle of patches and whatnot. So they're proselytizing. I want to let Monica speak to that, right? They're recruiting for physical, attackers. But in terms of turning the lights out, you have to be pretty sophisticated, and there's other factors that weigh into your thinking if you're Russia, even if you have the capability, let's say. There's other factors that weigh into whether you want to turn the lights out in Chicago, because there's going to be a ramification.
Monica, from the perspective of a social media company, how do you view the threats? And how does Facebook view the threats? Facebook is constantly being attacked, and people are trying to corrupt the platform. What's your view?
One thing that's different in the different threats that Tom mentioned is some are easy to define and some are harder to define. And so for terrorism, that's relatively easy to define. You still have, and believe me, I get plenty of questions about how do we define a terror group and if our line is in the right place. But everybody at least agrees on some sort of general common definition about non-state actors using violence to achieve a political goal. And you can quibble about the details of it, but everybody agrees it's bad. When you think about, generally speaking, when you think about cyber, a lot of what we're seeing are, there's your hacks where somebody is actually deliberately compromising the infrastructure of a company like Google or Facebook and stealing information. But then there are things like we saw from the Russians around the 2016 election, which is sharing content but maybe obscuring your identity, which, by the way, on a platform like Twitter, there's no requirement to use your real identity. So, is that even against their terms? And then you see things like sharing misinformation, which some people feel strongly that companies like Facebook and Google should be removing that sort of content, and others say it's really not the business of a private company. I would say actually the majority say it's not the business of a private company to decide what is true and what is false. So when we talk about these sort of more, as we get on the spectrum, when we talk about cyber threats towards the sort of misinformation or propaganda, one of the problems is defining it, another is agreeing that it's something that private companies should actually be tackling it. I would say we're seeing that sort of those sorts of behaviors increase, or the attempts at those certain behaviors increase. Part of that is because people are looking at actions that have been taken by state actors and trying to imitate them. So we're now seeing less sophisticated groups try to do the same things. But this is sort of a cops and robbers kind of game where we're getting better too. So if there's behavior that we know about, we're able to put up defenses to stop the old behavior. The challenge for us is staying ahead of the threat and trying to find the new behavior.
Yeah, how in a practical way does Facebook try to address these people who are trying to exploit the platform?
First, I should explain what our overall approach is on these sorts of things. So the terrorist content we remove. That's pretty easy. And if it looks like it's a physical real-world threat, like somebody planning an attack, then we will voluntarily, proactively send that to law enforcement authorities. And that's something that we do, and those relationships work well. When it comes to stopping misinformation, what we're doing right now, and this is by no means where we will settle, this is sort of, we're testing and learning, is we're trying to provide people more information so that they can make accurate determinations and they are not misled into thinking that they are, say, hearing from an American veterans group when they're actually hearing from a bunch of Russians. So we do that by recognizing that most bad actors use fake accounts or some attempt to obscure their identity, and that they will probably try to use ads to get more distribution for their message. And so understanding those two things, we have improved our technical tools to take down fake accounts. And then with ads, anything about political topics, we're requiring a lot more transparency, where, believe it or not, we actually send something in the mail, like a postcard in the mail, to the advertiser who wants to run a political ad, and they have to verify that that is their actual address, that they are really who they say they are. This is like the most cumbersome and,
So you actually use snail mail.
We are using snail
Go
mail
analog.
to verify ads on social media.
Old-fashioned dual authentication.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's a bar
So,
bet you ought to remember.
This is, like I said, not where we will end, but what this is a response to a changing threat, where we say, okay, if we're gonna see Russians using really compelling fake IDs to pretend that they are Americans, then what we have to do is actually send postcards to people until we get better at this. So those are some of the things we're doing. When it comes to misinformation, like somebody just going on Facebook and sharing what purports to be a news article about something real and it's some sort of fake news, we should talk about what the definition of that is, but something that is clearly a false story, then what we're doing is using technical tools to recognize when something is being shared on Facebook or Instagram in a way that suggests that it is false. We're sending it to third-party fact checkers, and if those third-party fact checkers agree that something is false, then we will counter the virality of the post, meaning we don't remove it, but we will reduce the distribution up to about 80%. And then we will also surface right next to it related articles from mainstream media outlets. So somebody shares a hoax, that content will still be there. If you go to that page, you can still see it, but we will actually underneath it put links with little thumbnail pictures to related articles on the same topic from around the internet. And that's a way of saying, before you believe this, you should know that actually most news sites are saying the opposite.
Tom, from a government perspective, do you think that's the right way of approaching this? Should we leave it to private actors? I mean, can we depend upon companies to be responsible, companies that may have a global reach, a global board of directors and so forth?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, I guess short answer is I'm happier with the government staying out of it, but I don't think it can completely abstain at this point from any involvement. I'm not an over-regulatory minded guy, but think of it this way. So Europe moved out with these massive regulatory requirements. I don't know if any of you follow that or kind of wrap your head around the cost of them, but the European regulations that Facebook and others now voluntarily, admittedly, comply with globally, right? It's too costly for
And
Facebook.
we're not required to do it globally, but we do it globally.
If you're required in Europe to follow these rules, it'd be very difficult to create the structures necessary to have a different set of servers, a different set of rule applications in your technical infrastructure. So you just, like California has very low environmental rules for cars. And so every car you buy in the whole country is just, California emissions compliant. You've seen that. It's a decision that companies take because they meet the lowest common denominator of requirement. and it makes sense to do that. But Europe has now taken the lead by doing that in the world and become the California of the world, and they've got more onerous regulations on companies than I would subscribe to as a US regulator. And so if we don't enter from a sheer, question of right or wrong, to your point, we should enter to be competitive.
Well, Monica, tell me a little bit more about that, where you're a global platform. How do you deal with different governments all over the world that want you to do it their way and maybe condition access to the platform because of that? How does that work?
It varies a lot depending on what they are asking for. If they're asking for user data, that's very different than if they're asking us to block content. Just for some context, on Facebook, we have more than 2.2 billion users. On Instagram, we have more than 1 billion. So these are pretty big services, and on both services, the overwhelming majority of the users are outside the US, like more than 80% or so are outside the US. So we are going to get requests from countries like India, Indonesia, Turkey, Russia to remove content, and often also to get data from people's accounts. And in some contexts, the clear answer is you comply. For instance, we get a search warrant from the FBI. They say, this guy committed a bank robbery and then apparently posted pictures with his bank robbery buddies, and they're holding up their bags with dollar signs or whatever. We would process that search warrant and we would provide the data. But if that is a request coming from the Vietnamese government, and they're saying, this person criticized the government, we want to know who it is and where she lives, then we would not comply. Our standard basically for giving data in response to legal process is first that we have to be compelled, and that's in part to meet our privacy obligations. We don't hand over data unless either there is a physical threat, like a terror attack being planned, or we're compelled to by legal process. And we only do it if it is consistent with international norms. And that basically means if this is anti-government speech, we want to track this person down, we're going to arrest him, we will just say no. Separate is the question of how do we respond if governments tell us speech is illegal in their jurisdiction and they want us to block it. There are times when we will block speech that people from an American legal background would consider, hey, that's lawful protected speech, it's political speech, maybe it's anti-government, maybe it's blasphemous in a certain religion, but it is protected speech in the US. What we may do is honor a court order or a legal request from a government where that speech is illegal. They will give us the URLs of the specific pieces of content, and we will make those pieces of content unavailable in that jurisdiction only. Classic example would be in India. It's illegal to burn the Indian flag. And so if people share an image of somebody burning an Indian flag, the Indian government may ask us to block that as illegal speech. And if they give us the right paperwork, we'll block it. We just block it only in India, and then we surface to users a notice saying, this content has been blocked in your jurisdiction by law. And then we publish a report every 6 months where we show by country what we have blocked.
So it's a public report that anybody can see what you've blocked, or?
It's not the actual specific pieces of content, but we'll say we received this many requests from the Indian government and we complied in this number.
And the technology is such that you can just block it in a particular area?
Yes.
But that requires investment and cost.
And smaller companies can't necessarily do that.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the question I was going to ask next. There's one thing for a Facebook, but there's lots of social media companies out there, and there's other people trying to get in that space. Is it time that we should have some regulation for this, Tom? And I know you're not a regulatory sort of guy, but I'm wondering how you can compel companies to do, quote, the right thing.
So you might not remember this, but after the financial collapse in 2008, there was a pretty onerous law passed, the Dodd-Frank banking reforms. And Jamie Dimon, the head of one of the largest banks in the world, came out and said, this is great. You're digging a really deep moat around the big 5 banks. Awesome. It's going to cost us a lot of money, but nobody else will ever be able to get across that moat and actually get inside this competitive circle. Yes. And so I would draw an analogy here. So what we might do, I'd like to say yes, but I want to be very, very circumspect about my answer. In fact, I actually want to tease out some of the students here with some basic questions, because they're usually fun for
Well, you can
anyone.
call on anybody that looks like a student, so.
No, I love, honestly,
The
you know
guy
what,
in the suit there looks like a student.
you know what, so I think there is a concern among some, and I don't direct this at Monica or put her on the spot anyway, but there's a concern among some that at some point, the FANG companies, you're familiar with this, the Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google's of the world, Alphabet, might end up becoming monopolists. Now, some of you are going through your antitrust law courses now. It's not necessarily bad to have or run a monopoly, as long as you haven't broken the rules in doing so. But it's not really great either, right? And so there's a lot of people worried about them behaving like monopolists over time. If we put a big onerous regulatory structure in place that does them the favor of speeding things along, I think we'll end up regretting it later because of all the things that are bad about monopolies and monopolists. But let me ask this. I used to go to a lot of cybersecurity events and ask senior people, supposed experts in the field, technicians, policymakers, corporate heads. You're in the business of studying law right now and deciding what the law should be, not just what it is. Should it be a crime to gain unauthorized access to someone else's computer or network?
Bailey, what do you think?
Anyone?
Bailey raised her hand. She just didn't realize it.
I mean, I would say yes, and I would liken it to almost like a physical invasion that you wouldn't, that already is illegal, and I think that they can be compared.
I like that answer. Do we get into then, if you're a strict interpretationalist, right? Do we then get into the intent and what they did with it? So one guy breaks into someone's network for the purpose of deciding if he could. And he says, I'm a white hat hacker. I just wanted to find out where the vulnerabilities are. I'll publish it later. I didn't do anything, but I did get in. And another guy breaks in and steals something, but he doesn't benefit. A third guy breaks in, steals something, and sells it for a profit, and it actually cuts into the profits of the company that he stole it from. Are all three equal? Under the current federal law, to give it away, all three are equal. And so it leaves to prosecutorial discretion all those other questions. And we've got a huge inconsistency in application. In fact, I would argue at this point that almost every prosecutor chooses not to pursue it because of the difficulties associated with pursuing it, successfully. But what I've always been shocked at is how many people answer that question, no, not yes. They say it shouldn't inherently be illegal. We should have to further examine their motives and what they did when they got there. And the greatest example I ever got was a real life case. I got a phone call and they said, hey, I know you're the cybersecurity policy guy, but could you help our school, private school has a problem. A student who's been accepted into a very prestigious university, not Duke.
Let's abstract that sentence a little bit.
Another university had already been accepted, but was then caught getting into the high school computer system. This is years ago. Getting into the high school computer system and changing not his grades, but his absentee record. Because he didn't want to be punished. There was some suspension or discipline that was pending. So I was tardy or late or absent too many times, whatever it was. And I want to change that record. He knows that the secretary has the password written underneath her keyboard. He gets in there when she's not there, types it in, changes his record, gets caught. And they said, we have to punish him. And technically, it's a violation of federal law. Should we call the authorities? And what should we do? Parents had ideas. Administrators had ideas. Ultimately, they decided, among other things, to not turn him over to the authorities, but to call the university that had accepted him, and the university decided to withdraw his acceptance because it was a competitive environment, and they didn't think that was an honorable thing to do. And he had to sit out a year because it was too late to go anywhere else. And that was a hard year for that kid. And I've always asked people if that's the appropriate punishment. And then I ask them, should we have thrown the federal book at him? And the people that say yes the first time tend to say, well, no, not in that case. So it's interesting. So I don't know how we begin the regulatory conversation on speech, but I do know how we begin the regulatory conversation and the legal conversation on unauthorized access, actual hacking into somebody else's network.
Can I build on what Tom said about thinking about regulation? The question that is often put to me is, should Facebook be regulated? Of course, the answer is we are already regulated in all kinds of ways, all over the world. We have a huge legal team that has to deal with that. Thank God it's not me, and we should talk about that too, as far as like career stuff. But anyway, when we think about regulation, the question is not should there be regulation. I think we all think there should be. It's just a question of what that regulation should look like. We already are subject to it now, but should it change? Should it be more comprehensive? Should it be globally applicable, and what would be required to do that? Like Tom said, regulation tends to focus on things like having certain tools built or being able to comply with user reports within 24 hours, certain things like that, that only the big companies can do. A lot of the codes of conduct that we have signed on to, we and Google and Twitter and Microsoft, we tend to be the big four, that if the EU is releasing something, some code of conduct against terrorism or hate speech, we are the signatories. There's a reason the smaller companies aren't signed on to that. For us, it's stuff we already do. It's, you've got to have terrorism policies in place. You have to be looking for this stuff. You have to have the ability for users to bring stuff to your attention. You have to have language specialists who will review this and remove it within 24 hours. You have to report it to authorities. That's like right out of what we do. But for smaller companies, it's much harder. And so just a kind of quick story illustrating this. A few years ago in DC, a couple senators were considering legislation that was to take a stand against social media companies on terrorism. And the bill said that if there is terrorist content that social media companies become aware of on their service, they must report it right away to law enforcement authorities. And it didn't define terrorist content. So this would put companies in the position where they might report something where privacy laws would actually say, there's ambiguity in the law. Privacy laws, let's say that somebody posts, I love ISIS, those guys are fabulous. That's not a crime. And if we had to report that to law enforcement authorities, we might be subject to liability, or there might be a lawsuit, or who knows, just something that would be unpleasant for the company. So the incentive you're creating for companies then is, I'm certainly not going to go looking for it. At Facebook right now, more than 99% of the content that we remove for being supportive terrorism, terror propaganda, anything like that, we find ourselves using proactive tools. It's actually way higher than 99%. And so when we're working with these smaller companies, as we've done for years, and we're telling them, you got to go looking for this stuff, we can help you find it, they're going to say no if it's going to mean they're increasing the chance that they're going to have liability. So that legislation, which went nowhere, but had it gone somewhere, actually would have made it harder for us to get smaller companies to do the right thing.
Let that sink in with all of you. So this is a real issue, right, and playing out in real life right now. If you're under a legal requirement with penalties attached to turn things over that are ambiguously defined, you won't go look for those things. Because as soon as you find them or potentially have something that might meet that rule or that definition, you have to make a decision, and you have to do it within a timely fashion.
Mm-hmm.
Monica, how big an infrastructure does Facebook have, people trying to manage what's on there and get off the... And the reason I'm asking is there's an article, my students know this, I like to have an in the news session, so I think I'll have an in the news session with you, impromptu. There's an article in the paper online in The Verge about Facebook's war room. What's that all about? And just in case people want to know what I'm talking about.
Right. So let me see if any of these folks are people on my team. Yep, they are. So one of the fellows in this photo works on cyber policy for my team. He reports it to Nathaniel. So basically, the war room is a concept that we use if we know about an event in a certain place where we suspect we're going to have content that violates our policies. We're going to have a spike in that type of content. And we might even have something going viral, or we might have somebody using Facebook Live, something that we really have to watch. And in an election, right, exactly. And elections are a classic example of that too. So we'll put up a room where we have people from all the different relevant teams. So you have...
Would it be something like that?
So, for example, something like this. So you'll have, I love when they do these kinds of photos because you always have like people like bending over computers and stuff like that. But so some people in this room are engineers, and they are responsible for the systems that actually go looking for abnormalities. Some people here are reviewers, so if there is a piece of content that's going viral in a weird way, there's somebody actually sitting there reviewing it and seeing if it violates our policies. And then some people are from my team who we write the rules on what's acceptable and not acceptable, so that if a game time decision needs to be made, then we can say, yes, this actually qualifies as hate speech. We're going to recognize this group as having protected characteristics or so forth, and we can make the decisions real time. In answer to your earlier question about how many people work on this sort of stuff, my team writing the policies is a little more than 100 people. My counterterrorism team, which is engineers, content reviewers, policy writers, lawyers, who spend their primary job is working on countering terrorists trying to use Facebook. That team is more than 200 people. And then in addition, we have engineers who are working on general safety tools, content reviewers who are looking at pieces of content that have been either flagged by users or flagged by our technology. And that number is around 20,000.
Yeah, in fact, that's what the article mentioned. What's interesting about this, and Tom, you might agree with me, this looks a lot, I've been on deployed combat operations where the command post looks a lot like that. And so it does resonate with the idea of a war room, but let me ask you this, and then I am going to go to questions, although I have a million more I'd like to ask. For both of you, the elections are coming up. What do you think in terms of, do you think Facebook is doing a good job at countering fake news and all that sort of thing? And Tom, the basic security of the election system, how concerned should we be?
You want to go first? Want me to go first?
I'll go first, because yours is more interesting. Mine's difficult to answer, but it's maybe more profound because it speaks to roles, responsibilities, and things that are actually achievable. And by the way, just as a quick aside, can you imagine the news coverage that would play out? Put yourself in watching CNN or Fox News the day after a terrorist successfully pulls off a terrorist attack, and we find out that his or her Facebook page said, "I love ISIS." And Facebook says, well, it's not illegal, right? And
To be clear, it does violate our policies. We would remove it.
yeah.
You can tell she went to law school. See, here's the value of having that law degree, even if you're in a non-traditional.
Can I tell this story?
Yeah.
That you and I did? So this ties into Charlie, who, in the category of questioners, when you leave one of these events, is one of the guys you want to see. Trust me, he has served, he knows what he's talking about, he's thoughtful, and he's not going to take your answer and put it on the front page of a newspaper. And when you go to Aspen, the other category of people you talk to, or two categories, are either reporters or ne'er-do-wells. I'll put them in the third weird group. Charlie's none of the above, but this Aspen opportunity is a chance to really have a summer camp for nerds. Security nerds in this case. So we all get out there and we're all very pasty and we put on shorts and we get a chance to, for 2 days, not be in the office. And Monica and I saw each other there 2 years ago and had a chance to go into the town. And if you've never been there, I thought it was a bar, but I guess it's a movie theater.
Yeah, we thought it was a bar.
There's a large...
Good. See, normal people.
There's a large sign. It's the ISIS, no kidding, it's the ISIS movie theater. And it's right downtown Aspen, and it
just says ISIS.
it just says ISIS.
Sign.
It doesn't say ISIS movie theater, it says ISIS. Now, it's been in business a lot longer than the terror group, but it's still there, and so we decided to take a picture in front of it. The president's sitting counterterrorism advisor and the head of counterterrorism for Facebook. And we have big smiles. And I said, I want to put that on your platform and see if if your algorithms can catch that picture. These guys are happy to be under an ISIS sign, or are they potential terrorists? It's a good story, but it's a serious challenge, right? That same picture, but not with the two of us in front of it, somebody in front of an ISIS sign taken in Syria should be concerning, right? In fact, it would be one of the indicia of the military men and women serving there to stop that person and interrogate them.
Fortunately, a lot of that has geolocation information embedded in it.
So that's the challenge for Facebook. They have to look into that. So I didn't answer your question here, but I thought I'd bring that up.
Just one little war story about the Aspen Summer Camp. One of the reasons I got interested in having Monica come out and talk to Duke Law students is she was on one of these panels, and some questioner, I think it was a news person, thought that he had some kind of creative question that nobody had ever asked, and that he would, back her into a corner. And as he was picking up his head after she answered it, she ripped his head off in a nice way. I would tell somebody, damn, she should be a lawyer. And somebody said, well, she is a lawyer. And so that started it. Let's open it up for some questions. Oh.
So for Monica, so you spoke about removing terrorist content and how there's kind of a pretty clear definition of terrorism. But what is Facebook's policy towards groups like Hezbollah or Hamas or the Sadr organization that might be considered terrorist by the United States, but in their own communities, in their own countries, are relatively mainstream?
Such a great question. We have a very broad definition. If a group has engaged in documented acts of violence or they proclaimed a violent mission, we will remove them as a violent organization, and this includes groups like Hezbollah, who also have a legitimate political presence. It's difficult, especially because we will see people engaging in speech that is, they're not supporting the violent part of Hezbollah. They're saying, I think this person would be a good leader in Lebanon, or something like that. And right now, we will actually remove that speech, because once we have labeled that a violent organization, then we'll remove any speech that praises or supports that organization. We're actually looking into how we can have a carve-out for when parties have been actually legally recognized and have standing for their people to run for government in specific countries. But it's operationally challenging, because we have billions of posts every day. A lot of this is flagged, a lot of the terrorist stuff, like I said earlier, is flagged by automated tools that are looking for things like iconography or use of slogans or leaders' names of these sorts of individuals. And then that gets sent to real people who have to make these determinations about how something is actually being used. Is this, for instance, a journalist who's talking about an ISIS attack and they're sharing names of attackers and photos, but it's for news purposes, in which case we want to allow it? Or is it somebody who's actually subtly promoting this organization? So this political carve-out that we're thinking about how to do, the key challenge there is actually the operational constraints of doing it accurately.
How do you deal with the idea of the citizen journalist? Like, everybody has a blog, it's a quote journalist.
So we don't say news organizations are held to a different standard. They're not. Everybody is held to the same standard, but what we look to see is somebody sharing something for the purpose of raising awareness about an issue. So if you were to post on Facebook, this attack happened, this was the attacker, we would allow it. But if you said, this attack happened, awesome, this guy's a hero, we would remove it.
This group is literally being finely trained to be cynical readers right now. That's how I would describe part of your education. I think that's an important thing. You're going to come out of this as some of the most thoughtful consumers of news in our country. Right now, where you are in your development, do you find something to be more credible if it's published under, I'll call it a curated media site? If the New York Times publishes an anonymous op-ed, do you find that to have more credibility because their editorial board reviewed the author and understood something about his or her motives? Then you would consider a posting by an anonymous person on a social media platform. You can't be anonymous on Facebook, but Twitter. Does the curated platform add credibility?
Ted, what do you think?
I think it does, in the sense that, over a much longer period of history, these institutions have developed a certain level of credibility that they have at stake every time they publish something. And as such, that functions, to create a level of self-restraint for them as producers of content for a marketplace of ideas. And with that in mind, they're used to not so much providing a forum, but rather being actors in the forum. And given their role in continuing to have a place in that forum, they have an interest in being responsible.
One of the things that you just mentioned is something that we're trying to build into the algorithm right now. This is not without costs, but we're trying to give our algorithm, basically, if you go to Facebook or you go to Instagram, there's a feed, right? And you see stuff in a certain order. Our newsfeed algorithm on Facebook looks at things like in the whole library of content that is available to be surfaced to you because you're friends with these people, you belong to these groups, you like these pages. How do we rank it? Well, we look at how recent something was posted, we look at the level of engagement it's getting, and we look at what you tend to engage with. You tend to like posts by this person, so we're gonna put it in your newsfeed. That's all done without us actually objectively evaluating the content in any way. We just look at sort of the back-end signals that tells us those three factors. For the first time, starting back in, I think, January, we announced that we are now looking for news sources that are trusted broadly, meaning we've actually done user surveys, and we look to see what publications have a broad level of trust across the political spectrum. And we are giving higher ratings, meaning higher in the algorithm, they get more weighting than other publications. So that's good from the standpoint of it's going to surface what most people consider to be more trustworthy, more reliable. And by the way, news content, it makes up about 4% of an average person's news feed. So you're not going to see a whole lot of news unless you go looking for it or you like the New York Times page or whatever. But still, you're more likely to see more trustworthy publications. However, after we put that out there, and I went around and was doing my normal sort of speaking engagements, I had smaller outfits come to me and say, how are we supposed to get that level of trust? Like, we're small, we're trying to do it right. We think that the country could use another reliable, objective media source, and there's no way for us to grow unless we can get that sort of distribution through your service, which I think is a valid point.
I raise that because some subset of you, I'm gonna guess, haven't thought about this very deeply before and don't realize that there's a difference between Facebook, not a publisher, and the New York Times or Wall Street Journal publisher. You know, among other things, you know, legal liabilities are different. Right? So when you're looking for deep pockets, everybody wants to sue the New York Times for libel or, you know, I mix up my libel slander here. But Facebook operates in a different world, and I think that anonymity is key to the debate. So when you hear and have these debates among your friends and you hear people say, oh, I can't believe Facebook allows this or doesn't do that or does something else, remember that at root, most social media is a broadcast channel for individuals. And so when you read whatever you're reading, whatever posting, the publisher is the individual that published, if that makes sense. And the social media company is just the platform. I know it sounds like a cop-out, but it's really not. And it's an important distinction. If you didn't hang on to that distinction, there'd be legal jeopardy everywhere.
Right.
And you wouldn't allow people to post things that weren't validated or in
It'd have
some
to
ways.
get approved. So
It-
social media as we know it would cease to exist.
Right, because you'd have to cite sources and so on and so forth.
Because we're running a little bit short on time, I wanted to ask you both about your careers. And Tom, I'm hoping you could share with us a little bit about how you got into government. You went to law school, but you went in government, a lot of non-lawyer positions. What was it like to work in the White House and so forth? And
Yeah, look, mine's easy, and it sounds a little bit maybe trite, but I was in law school, had served in some smaller level government jobs before, congressional staffer, and worked at a prosecutor's office and some things of that nature. And I was going to law school. I was working at a prosecutor's office. I had spent a summer at a firm, and 9/11 happened. Had that not happened, I'd have followed the careers that a lot of you are thinking about following. I probably would have gone into a prosecutor's office, but I might have gone into private practice. And I was excited about it. All those things, the future was in front of me, and 9/11 hit me at that point in time when I was, you know, right about your age for most of you. And it just galvanized me. And in fact, the first thing I did was I called my moot court advisor, who was a JAG Corps officer. And he said, well, you know what you ought to do is sign up. So I started filling out the paperwork. In fact, I was fully ready to go. And a friend of mine called, a former boss. I had two bosses, both named Barbara, at the time. One is now a U.S. Congresswoman. The other was killed on the flight that hit the Pentagon. And she carried a lot of weight at that point, and it was an emotional phone call. She said, do not go in. I have something else I want you to do that you can serve in, and you can do good, but you have to trust me. I can't tell you what it is. So for me, that's it. And what it turned out was she knew they were going to create a Department of Homeland Security, couldn't tell me. So I had to cool my heels for a little while. while I waited for her. And as soon as it opened up, I was in. So for me, it's been about government service since.
What was it like to work in the White House? I got to ask you.
Deep honor. Oh, okay, here's the best way to say it. I worked in 2 White Houses now, in 2 West Wings, not just on the campus, for 2 presidents. Extremely different human beings, George W. Bush and Donald J. Trump. Trump, citizen president, we all know he's kind of mercurial. His style is he goes through staff a little faster, that kind of thing, right? So, but there's a lot of commonality between presidents, and I've spent some time with President Obama as well. They are short on time, under a lot of stress, and they're immediately able to detect if you don't know what you're talking about. And they don't really care if you don't know what you're talking about, but they'd rather have somebody in there that does. And so if you don't know what you're talking about and you're not prepared, then don't go in. They have things to do, and they don't have time to cultivate you in your career. So it's one of those things. It's the anomaly in your career. Most of your career, I encourage you to cultivate your staff, the people that work for you, work as a team player, do everything you can to help better yourself and all those around you. In the White House, you're only going to be there for 2 to 4 years, so do your best, and some of the other stuff has to go out the window. That's it. But I'll tell you a story when Monica's done.
Monica, tell us your story, because you went from Harvard Law School to Bangkok, Thailand.
Yes.
That's,
I knew I wanted to be a courtroom lawyer. I had done high school mock trial, believe it or not, thought that was kind of cool, and wanted to be in court. And so when I was in law school, I worked with prison inmates and represented them at hearings and thought, okay, I'll either do criminal defense or criminal prosecution. Ended up becoming a prosecutor straight out of my clerkship and just loved it. And if you ever get the opportunity, it is just the best. So I did that. I thought I would spend a career doing that. And then got the opportunity with the Justice Department to go overseas and work on issues in Bangkok, Thailand for about 5 years. And then really sort of life intervened. My late husband was diagnosed with cancer. We knew we had to move back to the US for him to undergo treatment. And a friend of mine said, you know, since now you're gonna have all these big medical expenses and everything else, you ought to look at the private sector and you should come check out Facebook where he was working. And what I saw there was a lot of the same issues I was already working on. People, bad actors that were doing stuff in the offline world were doing stuff in the online world. And so I had the chance to go to this company and work on the same issues I was already passionate about. And so that's what I did. I will say that when I joined Facebook, I joined in a legal role. And I was not as bold as Tom, where I was thinking about, like, how else can I use my degree? I was pretty much like, you know, I'm a lawyer, I will have a lawyer job. And then when I got to Facebook, I really didn't like my lawyer job. And there was a woman who saw me in some meeting and said, are you interested in policy? Because the lawyers at this company are the advice givers, which is important, but the policy makers they're the decision makers. And I thought, well, that's actually kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. So I came over and took over the policies. And now my team uses the lawyers. We have a great relationship, and they will tell us, when you're thinking about alcohol advertisements in India, here's what you've got to meet, and here's what you need to be concerned about. And then we write the rules, which is a lot of fun.
Are there any courses or things that you would recommend for law students who maybe want to get into this space, either as a lawyer, as a policymaker, in government, other than taking my courses, which I'm sure is right on the tip of your tongue?
I mean, you probably have to take administrative law. I don't know if you do, but if you don't, I would take it.
You don't have to take it, I don't think. I totally agree with you. It's hard to figure people practicing law if they don't take administrative law or even evidence, even if you're not going to be a courtroom lawyer. But
Yeah, that's.
Yes, and I think, like, my reason for saying administrative law, I do think it's useful just as a lawyer, but also if you have an interest in doing the sorts of policy work that my team and increasingly other companies are doing, a lot of it is about writing regulations. That's what you're doing. And so understanding not only what goes into that substantively in considerations, but also what's an appropriate process for crafting, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry that I agree with that, because it'll be a little bit boring. One thing for me, I don't know if this applies to you, but I agree with that advice. I never took international law very seriously in law school because I didn't really, it was very frustrating. The concepts are all frustrating. And so I just did what I needed to. But we're increasingly in a world in which you have to be able to dabble in that space.
Yeah, when I went to law school, we didn't have international law because there weren't that many nations at that time. We had the Code of Hammurabi and that was about it. So let's say we have time for maybe one or two quick questions.
What are your thoughts on Facebook and Twitter being held liable under the material support statutes, either civilly or criminally? And do you think that given the fact that you don't consider them a publisher, that they would have a First Amendment defense to that sort of thing?
Me, I don't think their material support is too much. There'd have to be a degree of recklessness there that I can't fathom. In fact, there'd have to be a knowledge, a forethought, and a willing, kind of cooperation that, I guess, if we found it, I'd be comfortable pursuing them, but I don't think I would pursue them as a blanket matter, to your question, just for providing their service. But that said, I'm comfortable creating a lesser standard of requirement that's doable without creating a cost that's too onerous. And I'd rather give them some more strict, definitions. But again, I start the whole conversation from the premise that you all should be very careful about what you read and not believe everything you read. I mean, it sounds like my mother giving you advice and not some former senior advisor to the president, but don't believe everything you read. And by the way, pretty soon, don't believe everything you see. And that's a terrifying new reality that's on its way, I thought, at some point.
Yeah, one of the things that we're going to talk about at our conference coming up in February is deep fakes and that whole issue. But let's close it out with Monica. What do you think about in response to that question? I've heard you answer this before. Tighten the chin strap, but go ahead.
No, this is definitely, I
Go
mean,
easy.
like Tom said, I mean, you just have to keep in mind that if you are going to hold social media companies responsible for every single post that is published, then social media, as you know, it just can't exist. And I'll sort of leave it there. I think we have to actually keep in mind that we want these services to exist, and so we have to create reasonable regimes.
Go further, because holding them liable criminally is a whole different question. I mean, that's where I weigh in and say, as a society, I don't think that we gain any benefit there.
But even civilly, like earlier this year, SESTA and FOSTA, I mean, there was a question of making social media companies potentially liable if there was sex trafficking going on through their services. And we ended up, Facebook actually, we were the only company that actually supported the change in the legislation. And we did that because we thought the standard of knowledge was so high. I mean, it had to be basically that you wanted your site to be used this way. But even there, I understand why the other companies did not get on board with it. Like Google and Twitter, very good players. I mean, they have, like me, they have my team is a lot of former prosecutors and former child safety advocates and NGO folks and stuff. It's a lot of people who've worked on this, and they have a lot of the same stuff. So they really care about the issue, but they also recognize that if they are criminally liable or civilly liable for whatever is being published on YouTube at any given moment, I mean, that's just not something that they can continue to run.
Well, it was a great question, especially in light of Holder v. Humanitarian Law, because it's a crime to teach law under the material support statute. But unfortunately, we're out of time. I think our speakers might have a few minutes afterwards. Before you go, I want to tell you about some upcoming events. If you haven't seen this movie, it's actually really cool. We're going to have pizza there. It's actually for one of my seminars, but I want to open it up to everybody. And you'll get some expert feedback from that expert over on the far side there. And save the date for our annual conference. And thank you very much for coming. And let's give a big hand.